The village of Little Hemsby, nestled among gentle rolling hills and framed by ancient hedgerows, had always taken pride in its holiday celebrations. Each December, the townspeople gathered in the village hall, transforming the modest building into a scene of Yuletide charm. Holly wreaths adorned the doors, silver tinsel shimmered from the beams, and the scent of spiced cider mingled with the faint aroma of burning logs. It was a place where gossip flowed as freely as the punch, and everyone from the mayor to the baker felt a quiet camaraderie. This particular year promised to be no different, or so the villagers believed. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a corner with her knitting resting in her lap, observed the preparations with the calm patience that had become her signature. She was a small, unassuming woman with soft eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for decades and had spent countless hours noticing the subtle quirks and contradictions of human nature. Though she was an outsider in Little Hemsby, her keen sense of observation had already begun to make her a familiar presence to the locals. The hall buzzed with activity. Mrs. Carraway, the organist, fussed over the punch bowl, fretting about whether the recipe required more cloves. Mr. Bentley, proprietor of the general store, cheerfully argued with his assistant over the correct angle to hang the mistletoe. Children darted about, cheeks flushed with excitement, while mothers attempted to keep them in line, their voices layered over the tinkle of a nearby piano. It was in this swirl of ordinary cheer that a stranger appeared. Miss Marple noticed him first, not because he was particularly striking. He was of average height, dressed in a dark overcoat and a hat that hid most of his hair, but because of the way he carried himself. There was a careful precision in his movements, a measured calmness that contrasted with the village's lively energy. He stepped through the doorway with the polite air of someone accustomed to cities rather than cottages, and yet he seemed oddly self-conscious, glancing around as though expecting a less forgiving welcome than the one he received. "Good evening," said the stranger politely, tipping his hat. His voice was smooth, cultured, and slightly foreign, though Miss Marple could not immediately place the accent. The room fell silent for a moment, villagers exchanging curious glances. The vicar, Reverend Aldridge, hurried forward with his customary officiousness. "Ah, and who might you be, sir?" "My apologies for intruding," the stranger replied. "I am Mr. Julian Hart. I am a friend of Miss Fenwick from Hempton. She suggested I might join the festivities." Miss Marple's interest piqued. She had met Mr. Hart only in passing, at a small regional tea gathering months before, and yet she recalled his subtle charm, the faint hint of arrogance in the way he spoke. Now, she observed him anew, noting how he subtly scanned the room, making mental notes of the arrangements, the people, and even the positioning of the refreshments. There was a faint crease in his brow, as if he were calculating something beyond ordinary amusement. The villagers, ever hospitable, quickly enveloped him in conversation. Mrs. Carraway pressed a glass of cider into his hand, remarking on the exceptional quality of this year's mulled punch. Mr. Bentley launched into a proud explanation of the source of the hall's mistletoe, oblivious to the stranger's polite noncommittal nods. All the while, Miss Marple knitted, her eyes darting subtly between Mr. Hart and the other guests, noting each flicker of expression, each minor hesitation in speech. Children pressed close to the fireplace, eagerly waiting for the carol singers to begin. Outside, the first soft snow of the season drifted lazily down, coating the village in a quiet, almost magical white. It was the kind of scene that might have inspired a painter or novelist, a picturesque vision of holiday cheer. And yet, Miss Marple's instincts, honed over decades of observing human nature, whispered that beneath the laughter and warmth, a disturbance lingered, small but undeniable. For now, It was subtle. A glance held too long, a hand that lingered on the punch ladle, a smile that seemed forced. Most villagers would have ignored such trifles, attributing them to nerves or excitement. Miss Marple did not. She knew that the human heart, particularly when mixed with ambition, envy, or desire, often betrayed itself in the smallest gestures. The evening progressed smoothly, or at least it seemed to. Carols were sung, mince pies passed around, and laughter echoed against the wooden beams. And then, as the clock struck 9, Mr. Bentley suggested a traditional dance beneath the mistletoe. Guests paired off with cheerful enthusiasm. Miss Marple noticed Mr. Hart linger at the edge of the room, his gaze moving not toward the dancers, but toward the doorway, the windows, the corner where Mrs. Carroway had placed the punch bowl. His interest was selective, deliberate. It was then that the first shriek split the air, a scream so sharp and unanticipated that it cut through the festive ambiance like a knife. Guests froze, glasses trembling in their hands. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her knitting paused, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. From the far side of the hall came the source, Mrs. Fenwick, clutching her chest, her face pale as she pointed toward the floor. There, sprawled beneath the mistletoe, lay a body. The hall erupted into chaos. Some guests rushed to help, others stepped back in horror, and a few whispered frantic theories to themselves. Miss Marple, in contrast, quietly observed. The body, though unmistakably lifeless, had an expression that was almost serene, a puzzling detail in light of the violent interruption. The victim, she noted, had been struck in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. And in that moment, as the first snow continued to drift outside, and the villagers stared in shock, Miss Marple realized that a single ordinary evening in Little Hemsby had just been transformed into something far darker. The festival cheer had been irrevocably shattered, and beneath the tinsel and laughter, secrets long buried would soon demand to be uncovered. Somewhere in the corner, Mr. Hart's eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps calculation, passing between them. Miss Marple's small, sharp mind quietly filed it away. This stranger, she decided, was no mere visitor. He was a variable in a puzzle that had only just begun. And so, amid the snow, the mistletoe, and the startled cries of the villagers, the mystery took its first breath. The hall was a whirlwind of murmurs and half-formed theories. Villagers clustered in small, uneasy groups, whispering their astonishment to one another. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across anxious faces, while outside, snow continued to drift lazily against the window panes, indifferent to the human turmoil within. Miss Marple, as ever, remained in her corner, knitting quietly, her gaze sweeping across the crowd with a subtle precision that allowed her to observe without drawing attention. The first to speak was Mrs. Carroway, her voice trembling more with indignation than fear. "I simply cannot imagine how such a thing could happen. In our little village, it must be someone from outside, surely. A drifter, perhaps, or one of those traveling merchants who pass through." She clutched the edge of a chair as though it were a lifeline, her eyes darting toward the stranger who had arrived only that evening. "I saw him near the punch bowl just moments before." "Mr. Hart, wasn't it?" whispered Mrs. Fenwick, still pale from the shock, to her friend, Mrs. Abernathy. "I didn't know him well, but he looked strange, very deliberate. He seemed almost calculating." Miss Marple's lips twitched ever so slightly. Deliberate, calculating. These were observations, yes, but layered with anxiety and fear, which often distorted perception. She did not yet allow herself to judge. She noted the words, the inflections, and the subtle assumptions the villagers made. Every fear whispered a story about the observer, revealing motives and biases as much as any action could. Mr. Bentley, puffing out his chest in a display of masculine authority, attempted to restore order with a voice far louder than necessary. Now, let us not jump to conclusions. It's far too early to assign blame. The constable will be here momentarily, and he can take charge. I am certain there is a reasonable explanation. Perhaps it was an unfortunate accident. Someone tripped, fell under the mistletoe, and... Well, one never knows. An accident? Exclaimed young Lucy Pritchard, barely 17, her curls bouncing as she shook her head. That is absurd. Look at how he is lying. Someone struck him, deliberately. Don't tell me you haven't noticed that. The villagers fell silent for a moment, looking down at the body, noting details they had previously overlooked. There was an unnatural angle to the man's neck, a crimson stain spreading across his coat, and a faint bruise on his temple. Yet even as they whispered among themselves, Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the subtler signs, the neatness of his attire, the careful folding of his hands, the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering despite the cold. Each detail, though seemingly trivial, was a thread in a web that had only begun to form. As the constable, Sergeant Hawthorne, finally arrived, his footsteps quick and precise, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. He was a young man, eager and methodical, with a tendency to rely on the obvious, but lacking the patience to notice what was quietly unfolding beneath the surface. He immediately took charge, directing some villagers to assist with removing the body and securing the hall, while others were asked to provide statements. Now then, he began, clipboard in hand, I need everyone to remain calm. Please, no one leaves until I've had a chance to speak with each of you. Accidents, or incidents, are unfortunate, but we must follow procedure. Miss Marple watched him with mild amusement. The constable's confidence was admirable, but limited. He was trained to see facts, measurements, and immediate evidence. What he lacked, she knew, was an understanding of human subtleties, the little cracks and fissures in behavior that often betrayed truth far more reliably than any formal investigation could. While the constable moved among the villagers, questions were posed, half-formed guesses exchanged. I suppose it could have been the vicar, whispered one elderly gentleman to another, leaning in conspiratorially. He did have that dispute with the deceased over the parish accounts last month, did he not? Preposterous, Mrs. Fenwick interjected sharply. He may be strict, but murderous. I cannot believe it. Perhaps it's Mr. Bentley himself, countered another, his tone low and speculative. He was notoriously protective of his store's reputation. The deceased was a rather critical man, always questioning invoices and deliveries. Surely tempers could have flared. Such murmurs, so confidently delivered, revealed less about the victim than they did about the villagers' perceptions, fears, and their own past grievances. Miss Marple, quietly listening, catalogued each one with care. She recognized patterns, envy, defensiveness, long-standing grudges cleverly disguised as concern. The village, she reflected, was far from innocent. Beneath its polished, snowy surface lay fissures invisible to casual eyes. Meanwhile, Mr. Hart, the stranger, remained near the doorway, observing but not intruding. His posture, calm yet alert, drew Miss Marple's attention repeatedly. He spoke to no one, smiled rarely, and when approached, his answers were courteous but measured. She could not yet decipher his intentions, but she noted his patience, the deliberate restraint in his reactions, and the faint crease of worry that appeared when villagers speculated openly. The children, still trembling from the shock, were ushered away by their mothers, their curiosity mingled with fear. In the dim light of the hall, shadows played across the polished floorboards, and Miss Marple considered how long a secret, a lie, or a hidden resentment could survive in such a small, tightly knit community before it revealed itself in some unfortunate manner. By the time the evening had settled into a tense quiet, it was clear that the villagers' initial fascination had shifted to something more serious. Suspicion. The room, once warm with laughter and the scent of spice and snow, now pulsed with nervous energy. Each glance, each whisper, each hesitant movement carried weight. Like leaves trembling before a storm, Miss Marple, still knitting, finally spoke in her gentle, unassuming voice, though she addressed no one in particular. "It is remarkable," she said, "how quickly people can turn their attention to what they think they know, rather than what is true, and yet, truth, like snow, often settles quietly, waiting to reveal itself in the right light." No one heard, or at least no one paid much attention, but Miss Marple, as always, had already begun weaving together the first delicate threads of a puzzle that would unravel far more than anyone suspected. By the following morning, the village of Little Hemsby had taken on an air of hushed apprehension. Snow still blanketed the rooftops, muting sounds and lending a deceptive tranquility to the streets. Yet behind closed curtains and locked doors, whispers circulated like a persistent wind, carrying with them half-formed theories and conjectures that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Miss Marple, with her knitting tucked neatly under her arm, moved quietly among the villagers, absorbing the subtle cues that others overlooked. Her first visit was to the home of Mrs. Fenwick, whose shock from the previous evening had left her pale and trembling. Miss Marple noted how the widow's hands shook as she poured tea, how her gaze lingered on a photograph of the deceased, and the slight hesitation before she spoke. "I simply cannot imagine who would do such a thing," Mrs. Fenwick murmured, her voice trembling as much from residual fear as from fatigue. It was so sudden, so deliberate. Miss Marple nodded gently, as though agreeing with a casual remark, though in truth she was cataloguing every detail. The way Mrs. Fenwick's eyes flicked toward the window each time a neighbor passed, the faint scent of lavender masking the nervous perspiration at her temples. The way she spoke of the deceased as both friend and critic. It was in these contradictions, subtle as the threads of her knitting, that truths often revealed themselves. Next, she called on Mr. Bentley, who greeted her at the door with a mixture of pride and unease. His store had become a hub of speculation overnight, as villagers speculated about the identity of the victim's murderer. "Such a dreadful affair," he exclaimed, wringing his hands. "Who could have done this? And why here, in our hall?" Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "Sometimes, Mr. Bentley, the answer is not found in why, but in who. People act as they must, often under the weight of old grievances or petty jealousies. Observing how they behave can be more revealing than asking them directly." Mr. Bentley frowned, puzzled, yet Miss Marple saw in his furrowed brow the flicker of recognition, as if he understood more than he wished to admit. She noted the way he avoided eye contact when mentioning the deceased's recent criticism of the store's accounts, and how his hands tightened slightly when discussing the hall's decorations. Every gesture, no matter how small, contributed to the picture slowly forming in her mind. Outside, the snow crunched beneath Miss Marple's feet as she walked toward the village hall, now cordoned off by Sergeant Hawthorne. The young constable was busy taking notes and directing volunteers who had been enlisted to help sort through the scene. He looked up as she approached, a mixture of professional politeness and unspoken frustration in his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said briskly, "I'm glad you're here. Well, you understand how busy it's been. I could use your, assistance in calming the villagers. Perhaps help get statements You know the sort of things people tend to say." Miss Marple inclined her head, a quiet acknowledgment that she would do as requested, though her real purpose was more deliberate, while Hawthorne focused on the obvious evidence: the position of the body, the angle of the blow, the impressions in the carpet. She was attentive to the impressions that left no mark on paper. The micro-expressions, the shifting of weight, the subtle nervous tics of villagers under scrutiny. As she circulated among the crowd, she noticed patterns emerging almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Abernathy, usually so composed and articulate, spoke in clipped sentences, frequently interrupting herself as though afraid her words might reveal something unintended. Young Lucy Pritchard, whose initial curiosity had given way to a nervous fascination, lingered near the hall's entrance, occasionally glancing at Mr. Hart with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. Even the vicar, Reverend Aldridge, appeared to be carefully monitoring others' reactions, though his own manner suggested he believed himself above suspicion. Miss Marple observed all of this with quiet satisfaction. People rarely intended to betray themselves, yet they did, subtly, in the things they omitted, the questions they avoided, the glances they threw to one another. One remark, for instance, caught her attention: a fleeting comment from Mrs. Carraway about how the deceased had often visited Mr. Hart's hotel in the city, a statement intended to deflect suspicion, yet hinting at connections the villagers had yet to consider. Later, while examining the hall herself, Miss Marple paused beneath the mistletoe, letting her eyes travel over the polished floorboards and the faint scuff marks near the body's position. She noticed small details that seemed insignificant, but were anything but. A slight indentation in the carpet, a smudge of what appeared to be ash near the fireplace, and a strand of hair, fine and dark, not belonging to the deceased. These observations, while unnoticed by the constable, were the seeds of a much larger understanding. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had begun her subtle questioning, a process disguised as casual conversation. To Mrs. Fenwick, she spoke of the weather and the difficulty of keeping one's footing on the snowy path. Yet she steered the discussion toward the deceased's recent visitors. With Mr. Bentley, she discussed the logistics of the hall's decorations, noting carefully which volunteers had access to the upper corners and which had been absent during the dance. Even Mr. Hart, though elusive, could not escape the gentle probing of her conversation, where seemingly trivial remarks might elicit revealing responses. Throughout it all, Miss Marple maintained the quiet poise for which she was known. She never accused, never pressed, yet her questions, her observations, and her attentiveness created a subtle pressure. People responded in ways that revealed themselves to her trained eye, often unconsciously. She was learning who feared exposure, who concealed resentment, and who possessed the capacity for a calculated act of violence. When the villagers had retreated to their homes to reflect on the day's events, Miss Marple remained in the hall for a few moments longer. She traced the path of the deceased's last steps in her mind, considered the interplay of villagers' interactions, and quietly catalogued the anomalies she had observed. Outside, the snow continued its gentle descent, hiding no footprints but leaving subtle traces for those patient enough to see. And Miss Marple, knitting her thoughts as carefully as she knit her stitches, understood that the heart of this mystery lay not in the obvious evidence, but in the subtleties, the whispered fears, the concealed grudges, the small gestures that betrayed truth. The game had only begun, and already the patterns were emerging. By the next morning, the village of Little Hemsby had settled into a tense routine. Shops opened later than usual. The postman delivered letters in silence, and the usual chatter at the market was replaced by cautious glances and whispered speculations. The death beneath the mistletoe had left a shadow over the festive season, and the villagers, for all their civility, were quick to assign blame, even without evidence. Sergeant Hawthorne, eager to resolve the matter swiftly, had already formed an initial theory. The victim, Mr. Leonard Strathmore, a well-to-do guest from the city, had been well liked by some and quietly resented by others. According to Hawthorne, the most plausible suspect was immediately clear: Mr. Julian Hart, the stranger who had arrived unexpectedly at the party. His unfamiliarity, combined with his careful, measured demeanor, made him the perfect candidate in the eyes of the village and the constable alike. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. She had watched Mr. Hart closely, noting his subtle reactions and small gestures, and while he was undoubtedly mysterious, there was no indication yet that he was capable of murder. Still, she understood why the villagers had latched on to him. Human nature preferred an obvious culprit over a hidden one, especially when fear clouded judgment. Word spread quickly through the village. "It was Mr. Hart, of course," whispered Mrs. Abernathy to Mrs. Fenwick as they walked past the bakery. "No one else had the motive, did they? And strangers, you know, are often, well, unpredictable. I wouldn't be so sure," Mrs. Fenwick replied cautiously. "But he does seem different. I felt it last night, when he spoke so carefully to everyone." "Exactly," Mrs. Abernathy insisted, nodding. "He's too polished, too precise. That sort of man usually hides something." Miss Marple overheard the conversation as she passed the bakery, allowing a faint smile to touch her lips. She said nothing. Observation was her art, and judgment came only when all pieces of the puzzle were carefully considered. What others assumed as guilt often concealed more than it revealed. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Hawthorne called a brief meeting in the village hall, inviting Mr. Hart and several villagers to discuss the circumstances surrounding Mr. Strathmore's death. The room, though familiar from the festive gathering, now felt cold and clinical under the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple, quietly seated at the back, took careful note of each person's demeanor. Hawthorne began with a direct approach. "Mr. Hart, as you were present at the time of the incident, I must ask you a series of questions. Where were you when the incident occurred?" Mr. Hart's voice was calm, measured, yet edged with a subtle tension that betrayed the effort of maintaining composure. "I was near the refreshment table, speaking briefly with Mr. Bentley about the decorations. I did not leave the main hall, but I assure you I had no opportunity or inclination to harm Mr. Strathmore." The constable nodded, scribbling notes in his ledger. The villagers exchanged glances, some skeptical, some convinced by the stranger's civility. Miss Marple, however, watched the small inconsistencies, the fraction of a second's hesitation before he answered, the way his eyes flicked toward the fireplace, and the faint crease of worry that appeared when the subject of Mr. Strathmore's hotel visits was mentioned. Next, Hawthorne turned to the local suspects. There was Mr. Bentley, flushed with anxiety and a desire to appear cooperative. "I was assisting with the hall decorations," Bentley insisted, his hands trembling slightly. "I assure you, Sergeant, I had no reason to harm Mr. Strathmore." Mrs. Carroway, ever the nervous busybody, chimed in, "And I was attending to the punch. I had no contact with Mr. Strathmore beyond a passing greeting." Her eyes darted repeatedly toward Mr. Hart, as if seeking confirmation that suspicion had not shifted. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, observed them all. She noted the way Mr. Bentley avoided certain topics, how his gaze lingered too long on the punch table, and how Mrs. Carroway's nervous energy seemed amplified by her attempt to direct attention elsewhere. Each person had small tells, subtle signs of unease, and while none confirmed guilt outright, Miss Marple catalogued these as potential threads to follow. Outside, a few villagers huddled together debating amongst themselves. "I'm sure it was Mr. Hart," said a middle-aged woman. "How could it not be? He was the only one new to the village." "He doesn't seem capable of it," another countered, her voice small but firm. "But perhaps that is exactly what makes him dangerous. People like that, who plan carefully, well, one never knows." By late afternoon, a sense of tension had settled over Little Hemsby like a persistent fog. The villagers were divided, some convinced of the obvious culprit, some unsure, and a few, like Miss Marple, quietly skeptical, unwilling to be swayed by appearances alone. Miss Marple herself took a brief stroll around the hall, examining the scene from different angles. She noted the position of the furniture, the faint impressions on the floor, and the subtle disarray of objects that others had deemed irrelevant. Each observation added to the mental map she was building, connecting seemingly unrelated details into a picture no one else yet saw. And all the while, Mr. Hart remained calm. He answered questions politely, observed without comment, and carefully avoided drawing attention to himself. Miss Marple noted that his composure, though impressive, did not necessarily indicate guilt. It might just as easily conceal fear, uncertainty, or simple civility. As the day drew to a close, the village had settled into a wary quiet. The obvious suspect had been identified, the constable reassured by the appearance of progress, and the villagers cautiously resumed their routines. Miss Marple, however, knew better. The truth, she reflected, rarely wore such an obvious disguise. It lurked in corners, in gestures, in what people did not say. And as the snow fell silently on Little Hemsby, she resolved to continue her quiet inquiry. The puzzle had been set in motion, and the pieces would need careful assembling before the hidden pattern could be revealed. The morning following the initial investigation brought an uneasy calm to Little Hemsby. Snow still carpeted the streets, muffling the usual village noises, but inside homes and shops, the tension lingered like a stubborn chill. Miss Marple, as always, moved among the villagers with her quiet attentiveness, knitting in hand and eyes alert. The murder beneath the mistletoe had cast a shadow not only over the hall, but over the community itself, revealing cracks in relationships and long-buried resentments. Miss Marple had spent the previous day listening, observing and mentally cataloging details. Today, however, she turned her attention to something less obvious, a detail that had been dismissed by everyone else, yet hummed with quiet significance. She returned to the village hall, which had been reopened briefly under Sergeant Hawthorne's supervision, ostensibly to allow further examination of the scene. Most villagers had assumed all evidence had been noted. They were wrong. The body of Mr. Strathmore had been removed, and the hall had been tidied to a near-pristine state, but Miss Marple's eyes did not see only what was present. They sought the subtle disruptions, the traces left behind unintentionally. She paused near the fireplace, examining the hearth and the small pile of ash that had accumulated overnight. Something about it caught her attention. There was a faint, almost imperceptible smudge on the polished floorboards nearby, something that had been overlooked in the rush to secure the scene. Bending slightly, she inspected it closely. It was not simply a mark from hurried footsteps. It was deliberate, a disturbance in the ash as if someone had brushed against the hearth in passing. But more revealing was what lay beside it, a tiny fragment of paper, curled at the edges, faintly soiled by soot. Most would have ignored it entirely, assuming it trivial or accidental. Miss Marple, however, recognized its significance immediately. The fragment was from a letter, handwritten in a delicate, almost feminine script. The words were incomplete, but enough was legible. "Cannot allow this to continue. Must act before the holidays." No one can know. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, piecing together the implications. Here was evidence not of the physical act, but of the motive, a trace of planning, a silent whisper of intent that had escaped everyone else. It suggested premeditation, yet it also implied secrecy. The hand that had written this note had expected it to remain hidden, much like a small, easily overlooked clue beneath the ordinary chaos of a festive gathering. She tucked the fragment carefully into her handkerchief, knowing that its discovery would raise questions later. But she was far more interested in the context than in immediate confrontation. Her next step was to consider who among the villagers had access, both to the hall and to the intimate knowledge of Mr. Strathmore's movements. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Mr. Hart, of course. He was an outsider, polite and precise, but not yet revealing any overt link to the note. Her instincts told her he was careful, but she also recalled Mrs. Carroway's nervous mention of Mr. Strathmore's frequent city visits and the fleeting observation about the hotel he frequented. Connections were forming, but they remained tenuous, like the first threads of frost on a winter window pane. Turning her attention to the villagers, she noticed small inconsistencies in behavior. Mrs. Carroway, the organist, had spent much of the previous day insisting on her innocence while drawing attention to Mr. Hart. Miss Marple recalled a fleeting gesture, her hand brushing against the fireplace earlier, as if to smooth away an imperceptible mark. Could it be that the fragment had originated from someone she had dismissed in her casual observation? The possibilities multiplied quietly in her mind. She spent the morning speaking gently with a few key villagers under the guise of idle curiosity. With Mrs. Fenwick, she discussed the snow and the difficulty of navigating the streets, yet her questions gently probed for details of who had been closest to Mr. Strathmore during the party. Mrs. Fenwick, nervous and eager to reassure herself of her own innocence, revealed little directly but hinted at overlooked interactions. Guests who had lingered near the refreshments, hands that had brushed against the tables, glances exchanged in hushed tones. Miss Marple catalogued each nuance. She noted which villagers appeared unconcerned, which attempted to deflect attention, and which subtly observed others. Each reaction, however slight, became a potential key to the puzzle. Her mind, methodical and patient, began to link the fragment of paper to these observations. Someone with motive, opportunity, and a desire to conceal their actions had acted, but with an awareness that others would misread their intentions. By mid-afternoon, she returned to the hall once more, this time to study the mistletoe itself. Suspended from a central beam, its presence had originally seemed merely ceremonial, a festive touch. Now Miss Marple observed that the greenery was slightly askew, its placement unnatural. A closer look revealed faint scratches on the wooden beam above, a detail no one else had noticed. Small as it was, it suggested movement, perhaps a struggle, perhaps the careful manipulation of the scene to obscure an action. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, inward smile. The fragment of paper and the subtle disturbances in the hall provided the first tangible leads. Not forensics, not grand gestures, but small, human traces. One hand, deliberate or nervous, had left its mark, and in that, she knew, lay the heart of the mystery. As evening fell, she retreated to her temporary lodgings, carefully preserving the fragment of paper. Her knitting rested in her lap, yet her mind was active, connecting dots invisible to others. The village outside remained quiet, the snow forming a pristine layer over the streets, masking footprints and whispering secrets only the observant could discern. Miss Marple, alone with her thoughts, reflected on the hidden clue. It was so small, so easily dismissed, and yet it spoke volumes. Like many things in life, the most important truths were often invisible to those who lacked the patience or the eyes to see them. Tomorrow she would begin testing her suspicions, engaging the villagers subtly and watching their reactions. For now, the puzzle had shifted. The first piece of intentional evidence had revealed itself. Miss Marple understood that the path to uncovering the murderer would not rely on the obvious, but on the careful reading of human behavior, the unnoticed gestures, and the secrets hidden beneath the ordinary bustle of village life. And so, the mystery deepened, the threads of motive and opportunity intertwining in ways that only she could discern. The following days in Little Hemsby were marked by a tension that seemed to hang in the air, invisible yet palpable. The villagers moved cautiously, their steps measured, their conversations hushed. Even the normally cheerful shopkeepers exchanged wary glances, and the snow outside continued to drift lazily, indifferent to human unease. Miss Marple, as always, remained observant, her knitting resting in her lap as she quietly noted each nuance of behavior, each subtle slip of expression, each unguarded glance that betrayed thought or feeling. By mid-morning, she found herself in the village square, speaking with Mrs. Carroway. The organist's initial composure had begun to crack, revealing faint tremors in her voice and small hesitations in speech. I do not see why anyone would harm Leonard," she stammered, wringing her hands. "He was sometimes strict, yes, but not cruel. And yet," she faltered, glancing around nervously. Miss Marple nodded softly, encouraging the pause without pressing. Often, she reflected, the most telling confessions were not spoken directly, but emerged in hesitation, in avoidance, in the need to explain or justify. "It is remarkable," she said gently, "how long-held grievances can shape behavior, even when one believes them buried." Mrs. Carroway's lips tightened, and her eyes flickered toward Mr. Hart, who was passing by the square with a careful, measured gait. "And that stranger," she whispered. "He seems too calm, too deliberate. I do not trust him." Miss Marple noted the deflection, cataloging not only what was said, but why it was said, distracting attention, masking unease, or perhaps simply attempting to assert control in an uncertain situation. These were subtle signals that the ordinary mind might overlook. Meanwhile, Mr. Bentley had taken to wandering the streets, ostensibly to greet customers, but in reality, it seemed to observe reactions. Miss Marple followed discreetly, noting the slight tension in his shoulders, the quickened steps when he passed the hall, and the occasional glance over his shoulder as if expecting to find someone following him. He spoke to no one directly about the murder, but his behavior, more than his words, suggested a consciousness of something unsaid, a secret lurking just beneath the surface. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the hall for a closer look at the scene. The mistletoe, still hanging in its awkwardly suspended position, seemed almost symbolic of the night's events. She ran her fingers lightly over the beam, noting again the faint scratches she had observed before. These marks, along with the fragment of paper she had preserved, were not merely incidental. They were the first tangible signs of interference, of human presence and intent, and they spoke volumes about someone's attempt to manipulate appearances. Her observations were interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Aldridge. The vicar, usually so composed, seemed unusually uneasy. "Miss Marple," he said, voice low, "I must speak with you in confidence." They stepped aside, out of earshot of the few lingering villagers. "I cannot shake a troubling suspicion," he admitted, wringing his hands. "There have been whispers, of course, but some of the things Leonard did, his criticisms, his insistence on propriety, they may have provoked more than simple irritation. I fear that some among us are not as innocent as they appear." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. The vicar's concern was genuine, yet it revealed more about him than about anyone else. Those who spoke of suspicion often betrayed their own awareness of motives, resentments, or knowledge of hidden grievances. The web of relationships in Little Hemsby, she thought, was intricate indeed. Later that evening, a confrontation emerged at the bakery, a location Miss Marple had chosen deliberately for her observations. Mrs. Fenwick and Mrs. Abernathy met there, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for a memorial service, yet the conversation quickly veered into pointed scrutiny. "Do you truly believe it was Mr. Hart?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, her voice low and sharp. "I cannot say," Mrs. Fenwick admitted, "but there are things Leonard never shared with us. Things I only learned recently. A disagreement over a will, a letter, perhaps. Matters that might seem trivial but could have mattered to the wrong person." Miss Marple, quietly observing from a nearby table, noted the hesitation, the careful word choice, and the subtle glances toward the door, as though both women feared being overheard. Every exchange, she realized, was a clue. Not in its content, necessarily, but in its rhythm, its tension, and the half-truths layered beneath the polite veneer. Even the children were not immune.
Lucy Pritchard, eager and observant, had overheard fragments of conversation between adults, whispers of resentment and fear, which she now repeated in innocent yet revealing questions.
"Why did Mr. Bentley frown at Uncle Leonard?" she asked her mother. The answer came evasively, but the child's persistence subtly highlighted cracks in the villagers' carefully maintained facades. Miss Marple also observed Mr. Hart during these interactions, though he did not directly engage in the confrontations. His attention was never entirely absent. A flicker of recognition passed across his eyes when certain names were mentioned, but he did not react overtly. This restraint, she noted, was significant. Someone with nothing to hide would not need such vigilance, yet someone guilty might manage the same calm, calculated composure. By the day's end, Miss Marple had begun to see the outlines of a network of secrets, old rivalries, unspoken resentments, concealed grievances, and hidden ambitions all converged in subtle ways. A slight brush of hands, a nervous glance, a carefully measured pause. Each was a piece of the puzzle, invisible to the casual observer, but telling to someone trained in reading the human heart. As night fell over Little Hemsby, the village seemed to hold its collective breath. Miss Marple, alone in her lodgings, reflected on the day's discoveries. The murder beneath the mistletoe had revealed more than the act itself. It had exposed layers of human behavior that were often hidden beneath civility and custom. Every villager, she noted, had something to hide, whether motive or memory, and it was precisely in these hidden details that the truth might eventually be found. The mystery, Miss Marple realized, was no longer about the simple question of who had struck Leonard Strathmore. It was about uncovering the intricate web of secrets, resentments, and concealed intentions that had led to that singular, devastating moment. And in that she knew patience and observation would prove far more revealing than confrontation or force. The quiet of Little Hemsby was shattered the following morning, not by snow or wind, but by news that sent ripples of shock through every household. Another incident had occurred, an unexpected theft from the village post office. A small but valuable parcel, recently delivered to Mrs. Abernathy, had vanished without a trace. Though the loss seemed minor compared to the tragedy beneath the mistletoe, the implications were significant. Who and why would strike again so soon? The villagers, already tense from Mr. Strathmore's death, reacted with immediate alarm. Gossip flourished in the streets, each person offering a theory that revealed as much about themselves as the crime. "It must be the stranger," declared Mrs. Carroway, voice rising in indignation. "He has no roots here, no loyalty. He's capable of anything." "Perhaps," countered Mr. Bentley, "but the parcel was taken in broad daylight. How could he, or anyone, have managed that without being seen?" Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the window of the post office, listened without interjecting. Her sharp eyes took in the reactions of the villagers, noting each twitch of the mouth, the hesitation in speech, the subtle glances exchanged. The theft, though seemingly trivial, offered a new dimension to the mystery. It suggested either a second act of malice or a deliberate attempt to distract and mislead, a psychological maneuver to confuse the investigators. Sergeant Hawthorne arrived shortly thereafter, flustered and eager to assert authority. "This is becoming intolerable," he exclaimed. "First the murder, now theft. We must act swiftly. I intend to question everyone again, every villager, every guest. No one is exempt." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, letting the constable's intensity pass over her. The chaos, she thought, was fertile ground for observation. People revealed themselves in stress, in fear, and in the subtle ways they tried to maintain appearances. What Hawthorne saw as disorder, she saw as clarity. She began with Mrs. Abernathy, the direct victim of the theft. The woman's hands shook as she recounted the events. "I saw nothing," she said, her voice quivering. "I left the office for barely a moment, and when I returned, it was gone. Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple noted the emphasis on absence, on the moment Mrs. Abernathy had not observed. It was precisely in such unguarded instances that opportunity revealed itself. She asked gentle, indirect questions. Who had been near the office, who had errands that morning, and who might have had cause to interfere? Each answer, hesitated over or volunteered too quickly, revealed its own truth. As the morning progressed, attention inevitably returned to Mr. Hart. Villagers were eager to point to the stranger, noting his presence in the square and his calm, measured demeanor. Yet, Miss Marple observed carefully, Hart had not approached the post office, had no evident connection to the parcel, and displayed no reaction beyond mild curiosity. His composure, consistent as ever, did not equate to guilt. In fact, it suggested a careful awareness of scrutiny, rather than malevolence. Miss Marple then turned her focus to Mr. Bentley, whose nervous glances toward the post office had not gone unnoticed. "I ran some errands this morning," he admitted reluctantly, "but I did not enter the office. I merely passed by." His words were accompanied by a subtle tightening of the jaw, an involuntary indication of concern or concealment. Miss Marple made a mental note. Opportunity, she knew, was often as important as motive. Someone had acted quickly, efficiently, and with awareness that their actions could be interpreted as another crime. The theft was more than an act in itself. It was a stage, a performance designed to distract, confuse, or mislead. By late afternoon, a small confrontation emerged at the market. Mrs. Carroway, still convinced of Mr. Hart's culpability, approached the stranger directly. "Tell me, Mr. Hart," she said, voice sharp with accusation, "where were you this morning when the parcel disappeared? And do you deny any involvement in last week's tragedy?" Hart's response was calm, almost rehearsed. "I was walking in the square, purchasing some necessities. I did not enter the post office, and I had no reason or desire to interfere with anyone's belongings. As for the incident at the hall, I had no part, nor would I." Miss Marple watched the exchange closely, noting more than what was spoken. Hart's eyes flickered briefly to Mrs. Carroway's gloved hands, the slight tremor in her voice, and the way she leaned forward with anticipation. She was attempting to provoke a reaction, and in doing so, she may have revealed more than she intended. Nearby, Mrs. Fenwick and Lucy Pritchard observed silently, discussing in hushed tones the recent events. "It seems as if the second incident is meant to confuse everyone," Mrs. Fenwick remarked, "to shift suspicion away from the true cause." Miss Marple's mind worked quietly. Yes, the theft was designed as a diversion. Yet its subtleties, the choice of victim, the timing, the manner in which it was conducted, suggested a sophistication beyond mere impulse. Someone was carefully orchestrating events, manipulating perception, and testing reactions. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the snowy village, Miss Marple considered the patterns emerging. The murder beneath the mistletoe had revealed old resentments, hidden motives, and subtle gestures of guilt. The theft had now added a layer of misdirection, demonstrating the culprit's awareness of observation and suspicion. She sat quietly on a bench in the village square, knitting needles moving almost absent-mindedly, and reflected on the subtle truths each event had revealed. The obvious suspect, the stranger, remained under scrutiny, yet the deeper currents of motive, opportunity, and human behavior suggested someone far closer, someone less conspicuous. The villagers returned to their homes that evening, exhausted by speculation, yet unknowingly leaving Miss Marple with more insight than any direct evidence could provide. She understood that the key to uncovering the murderer lay not in brute investigation, but in careful observation, the gestures, the hesitations, the unspoken tensions that revealed more than any spoken accusation. And as the shadows lengthened over Little Hemsby, Miss Marple's quiet satisfaction grew. The twist of the theft had not confounded her. It had illuminated new avenues of inquiry, pointing toward motives, opportunities, and secrets that no one yet suspected. The game, she realized, was far from over, but the path ahead was becoming clearer, stitch by careful stitch, like the precise knitting that lay in her lap. By the time the following morning arrived, Little Hemsby was caught between unease and curiosity. The murder beneath the mistletoe, followed by the theft at the post office, had unsettled the village in ways more profound than the villagers would admit. Life continued outwardly as usual. Shops opened, church bells rang, snow fell gently, but beneath the ordinary surface, tensions simmered. Miss Marple, however, moved among the villagers with her usual calm, understanding that the next stage required precision, subtlety, and patience. Miss Marple had spent the prior days quietly observing, listening, and noting discrepancies. Now she knew it was time for a more direct, albeit gentle, approach, a psychological test designed to provoke reactions without confrontation, to allow the guilty to reveal themselves in behavior rather than confession. The plan, as always, was invisible, executed with her understated genius. Her first step was to invite several villagers to her cottage under the guise of tea and conversation. She sent no message of suspicion, no mention of the ongoing crimes, only a polite note suggesting a discussion of winter preparations and upcoming festivities. The guests included Mrs. Carraway, Mr. Bentley, Mrs. Fenwick, Lucy Pritchard, and, of course, Mr. Hart. Each arrived cautiously, aware of the atmosphere of unease but unaware of Miss Marple's intent. Tea was served in the usual manner, delicate cups and saucers arranged with care. Miss Marple sat knitting in the corner, occasionally lifting her gaze to observe her guests. She began the conversation lightly, discussing local matters, the condition of the church roof, the cost of coal for the winter, and the upcoming village fair. Each topic was neutral, meant to lull the participants into ease, while subtly creating opportunities for reactions that might reveal concealed truths. It was during a discussion of the village hall decorations that Miss Marple's true test began. "You know," she remarked casually, "it is remarkable how much effort goes into appearances. A well-placed decoration, a small adjustment here or there, and suddenly the entire effect changes. One could almost say appearances can be deceiving." She glanced softly at the group, allowing the words to sink in. Immediately, Mrs. Carroway's fingers tightened around her teacup. She looked from one guest to another, eyes darting in subtle panic. "Deceiving?" she echoed nervously, her voice wavering. I don't understand what you mean." Miss Marple smiled, knitting another row. "Oh, nothing in particular, just an observation. People often reveal more about themselves when discussing ordinary things than when questioned directly about the extraordinary." Lucy Pritchard, sensing her mother's unease, whispered, "Do you mean about Leonard?" Her innocent curiosity carried a weight the child could not understand. Miss Marple allowed the remark to pass with no direct acknowledgement, yet she noted the quick glance between Mrs. Carroway and Mr. Bentley. Subtle tensions, flickers of guilt, and fear of exposure were evident in the fleeting gestures of those with something to hide. Later, she introduced the topic of Mr. Strathmore's last evening in the hall. "It was a festive occasion," she observed lightly, "and yet even the most careful arrangements can be disrupted. One small action, unnoticed, can change everything." Her eyes rested briefly on each guest, pausing ever so slightly on Mr. Bentley and Mrs. Carroway. It was the subtle tightening of Mrs. Carroway's lips, the faint blanching of her cheeks, and the flicker of fear in her eyes that drew Miss Marple's attention. Similarly, Mr. Bentley's hands, which he had tried to keep still, betrayed a slight trembling, an unconscious response that suggested awareness beyond innocence. The reactions were delicate, almost imperceptible, yet in combination they formed a pattern she had learned to recognize over decades of observation. Then, with perfect timing, Miss Marple shifted the conversation to the topic of secrecy and letters. "Sometimes," she said, "we write things we hope no one will read. A message left behind can mean little to most, yet be of enormous significance to one person." She leaned slightly forward, eyes soft but deliberate, watching the responses carefully. Mrs. Carroway's teacup rattled faintly as she set it down, her knuckles whitening. I don't write secret messages," she stammered, eyes darting about as though seeking validation from others. Mr. Bentley, attempting to regain composure, coughed nervously and avoided Miss Marple's gaze. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, allowed the tension to linger. No accusation was made, no name uttered. The test was not in the words, but in the reactions. Each micro-expression, each hesitation, each unguarded movement was a revelation. The guilty mind, even under restraint, could not suppress instinctive responses entirely. By the time the tea was concluded, Miss Marple had gathered what she needed. The villagers departed, some with relief, others with lingering unease, but all had unwittingly contributed to the subtle map of behavior she had been constructing. Alone, she reviewed the mental notes, the reactions, the half-formed gestures, the tensions that surfaced when certain topics were mentioned. It was clear to her that the apparent innocence of Mr. Hart was genuine. His calm was measured, his gestures consistent, his reactions unremarkable under pressure. The true culprit, Miss Marple realized, was far closer, someone whose anxiety had betrayed an inner knowledge of events. Mrs. Carroway and Mr. Bentley, in particular, had exhibited patterns that suggested familiarity with both the murder and the subsequent theft. Subtle manipulations, fleeting panic, and defensive gestures. Yet she was not ready to reveal the truth. One final observation remained necessary, one last delicate test to confirm her conclusions. The human mind, she understood, could be both fragile and revealing, and the final proof would come not from evidence alone, but from watching the guilty react to a truth they could not yet name. As she placed her knitting aside and prepared for the evening, Miss Marple reflected that the village of Little Hemsby had provided everything she needed: patterns of behavior, fleeting gestures, whispered contradictions, and subtle clues carefully hidden in plain sight. The next phase, she knew, would bring the revelation closer, and soon the carefully woven threads of human deceit would unravel before her patient, unassuming gaze. The game was nearing its conclusion, and Miss Marple, ever calm, ever observant, was ready to watch the final reactions with her gentle but incisive insight. The following evening, the village hall was once again prepared for an assembly. Though the atmosphere was anything but festive, the villagers gathered reluctantly, whispering in low tones, uncertain of what to expect. Miss Marple, knitting calmly in her usual corner, waited with serene composure. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the time when careful observation, subtle probing, and patient inference would converge to expose the truth. Sergeant Hawthorne, unaware of the subtlety behind her plan, stood at the front, eager for a resolution. "I trust we may finally bring some clarity," he announced, attempting authority but betraying his impatience. The villagers murmured, glancing at one another nervously, some avoiding direct eye contact altogether. Miss Marple rose quietly and addressed the assembly with gentle firmness. "We have all been unsettled these past days," she began, her voice soft, yet carrying through the hall. "The incidents, the tragedy beneath the mistletoe and the subsequent theft, have cast suspicion widely, and understandably so. Yet appearances, as we know, are often deceiving." She paused, allowing her words to settle, noting the reactions. Mrs. Carroway shifted uneasily, and Mr. Bentley's hands tightened against the edge of the chair. Even those who believed themselves unaffected displayed subtle signs of tension. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp beneath her gentle expression, had already charted the patterns of deception, and now she intended to confirm them in public. "The stranger, Mr. Hart," she continued, "has been under suspicion by many. He is new to our village, and his calm manner, combined with unfamiliarity, has made him appear suspicious. Yet upon careful observation it is clear he bears no guilt. His behavior, his reactions, and his movements throughout the events reveal nothing inconsistent with innocence." A collective murmur ran through the hall, some surprised, others skeptical. Hart himself remained composed, though a faint smile of relief touched his lips. Miss Marple allowed the pause to deepen the effect. "The true culprit," she said softly, "is someone who has acted under the guise of civility, whose intent was carefully hidden beneath a veneer of concern and politeness. We know this because subtle signs, the trembling hands, the half-formed gestures, the nervous reactions to innocent remarks, have betrayed the presence of guilt." She allowed her gaze to settle first on Mrs. Carroway, then on Mr. Bentley, observing the slight blanching of the skin and the involuntary stiffening of posture. "Mrs. Carroway and Mr. Bentley, you both acted with knowledge of events that none but the guilty would possess. The fragment of paper, found near the hearth, contained evidence of premeditation. The theft from the post office was no random act. It was a carefully orchestrated diversion to test reactions and deflect suspicion." Mrs. Carroway gasped, her hands flying to her face. Mr. Bentley's jaw tightened, and his eyes shifted rapidly from Miss Marple to the floor, as though seeking refuge in the absence of direct accusation. I don't understand," Mrs. Carroway stammered. "I only—" "You sought to mislead us," Miss Marple said gently, her voice never rising, because the consequences of your actions weighed upon you. You feared exposure, yet, in your effort to conceal the truth, you revealed it through behavior alone. The trembling hand, the diverted gaze, the sudden panic at casual mention of letters or disturbances in the hall. These are signs of guilt more eloquent than any confession. She motioned toward the fragment of paper, preserved carefully in her handkerchief. This note, discarded and overlooked, indicates intent. Its placement near the hearth, seemingly trivial, was meant to be hidden, yet it was left in a spot easily traced to one familiar with the hall and its arrangements. Only those intimately aware of Mr. Strathmore's routine could have acted as you did. A tense silence filled the room. Mrs. Carroway's lips trembled, and Mr. Bentley's eyes darted nervously toward the doorway. Miss Marple continued with patient clarity. "Consider also the theft of the parcel at the post office. Its timing and nature were deliberate. The objective was not the value of the item, but the opportunity to observe reactions, to test the vigilance of others, and to create a distraction. The pattern is unmistakable when seen through the lens of behavior rather than mere circumstance." Mrs. Carroway's voice broke finally. Yes, it was us. But, oh, I did not mean. He. She choked on her words, overcome by the weight of exposure. Mr. Bentley finally spoke, admitting with quiet resignation, "It was a plan. Foolish, terrible, but intended only to frighten, not to harm. We did not expect, not—" Miss Marple raised a hand, calming the confession. "Intent and consequence are often separate, yet both matter in understanding the truth. Your actions led to tragedy, yes, but it is in understanding the human motivations, the fears, resentments, and secret calculations that we comprehend why these events unfolded. Leonard Strathmore's death was not random. It was entwined with grievances long held, concealed until the right moment. The villagers listened, rapt, some with relief that the mystery was solved, others with shock at the revelation that the true culprit was not the outsider, but familiar faces among them. Mr. Hart's calm composure now seemed almost heroic in contrast, and Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile of satisfaction. "The village may now return to its ordinary rhythms," she concluded gently, "but let us remember that appearances, no matter how convincing, can deceive. And human behavior, subtle and easily overlooked, often reveals truths far beyond what is seen at first glance." As the assembly dispersed, Mrs. Carroway and Mr. Bentley were quietly escorted away by Sergeant Hawthorne, their guilt confirmed, their plan unmasked. Outside, the village seemed lighter somehow, as though the lifting of suspicion allowed a collective sigh of relief. Miss Marple, however, remained reflective. The intricacies of motive and human behavior, the hidden resentments and silent fears, had all converged to create a tragedy that could have been avoided if only awareness had been more careful. Miss Marple lingered for a moment, gazing at the snow-covered square. The village would heal slowly, and life would resume, yet the lessons of observation, patience, and the subtle truths revealed through human behavior would remain. She turned and walked home, knitting needles clicking softly, the quiet detective satisfied that the threads of deceit had been unraveled, the hidden culprit exposed, and the mystery of the stranger beneath the mistletoe finally resolved. In the days following the revelation, little Hemsby slowly began to return to its ordinary rhythm. Though the shadow of recent events lingered, the snow melted in places, revealing cobblestone streets and the first signs of frost-hardened grass. Windows, once hastily shuttered in apprehension, now reflected the soft glow of candlelight and the cautious resumption of daily life. The villagers moved about with an air of tentative relief, their conversations tinged with whispers of disbelief and lingering curiosity. Miss Marple, knitting in her usual corner of the parlor, observed these subtle changes with the quiet satisfaction of one who understands human nature deeply. The revelation of Mrs. Carraway and Mr. Bentley as the perpetrators had provided closure in the most literal sense. Yet she knew that understanding extended beyond the simple identification of guilt. It was the intricate tapestry of motive, fear, and human weakness that truly mattered, and she took the time to consider each thread carefully. The village hall, now under closer management, was reopened for public gatherings. The mistletoe, once the silent witness to tragedy, was removed and replaced with simple, seasonal decorations. Children returned to practice for the village play, their laughter a tentative counterpoint to the weight of previous events. Mrs. Fenwick, relieved to see some semblance of normalcy, volunteered to organize the fair, insisting that joy could coexist with caution and remembrance. Yet, beneath the cheerful surface, subtle lessons had been absorbed. Conversations carried an unspoken awareness. People noticed small gestures more keenly, paused before drawing conclusions, and listened to one another with a greater patience. Miss Marple, for her part, noticed how the villagers' reactions shifted in response to each other. Glances exchanged, hesitations in speech, and quiet acknowledgement of the recent turmoil. Social dynamics, she reflected, were as revealing as any overt act, and understanding them was essential to navigating the hidden complexities of community life. Sergeant Hawthorne, whose impatience had been tested throughout the case, acknowledged Miss Marple's contributions quietly one afternoon. "I admit, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat with a mixture of respect and mild embarrassment. "I underestimated your methods. It seems the village owes you a debt of gratitude, though I doubt many will ever articulate it." Miss Marple smiled gently, her hands still busy with her knitting. "We all observe and interpret in our own ways, Sergeant. Sometimes it takes patience and attention to the smallest details to see the full picture. You applied your strengths admirably in your own manner, and for that I am grateful as well." The villagers themselves responded to the aftermath in varied ways. Mrs. Carraway and Mr. Bentley were quietly escorted away, their departure a sober reminder of consequences. Neighbors exchanged sympathetic, yet cautious glances, recognizing the fragile balance between understanding human folly and maintaining communal trust. The small village, usually insulated from such dramatic events, had been forced to confront the complexities of deceit, resentment, and unintended consequences. For Miss Marple, the experience reinforced what she had always known. Human nature is both predictable and endlessly surprising. People's actions are often shaped by past grievances, concealed ambitions, and unspoken fears. The outwardly ordinary can conceal motives capable of extraordinary impact, and it is in observing the subtle signals, the nervous glance, the hesitation, the unguarded gesture, that truth is revealed. One crisp morning, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the snow-covered streets, greeting villagers with polite nods and soft inquiries. The air was filled with a gentle calm, though she noted the lingering vigilance in some faces. It will pass, she thought, as all things do. Yet the memory of these events will linger in the mind of the village, shaping future interactions in ways subtle but significant. Lucy Pritchard, cheerful, despite recent turmoil, ran to Miss Marple with a bundle of wildflowers she had gathered. "For you, Miss Marple," she said, placing the small bouquet in the older woman's hands. "Thank you for helping everyone." Miss Marple accepted the flowers with a smile, ruffling the child's hair gently. "You have a keen eye and a good heart, Lucy. Remember, it is often the smallest observations that reveal the most important truths." The child nodded, wide-eyed, and skipped away, leaving Miss Marple with a quiet moment of reflection. That evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of twilight and the first stars appeared, Miss Marple returned to her parlor. She placed the small bouquet in a vase on the window-sill, where it caught the fading light. Her knitting rested in her lap, yet her mind remained active, reviewing the events and behaviors that had led to the resolution of the case. She considered how each small gesture, overlooked conversation, and subtle hesitation had contributed to a larger pattern, one that revealed motives, intentions, and ultimately the guilty parties. Though the village had returned to routine, Miss Marple knew that human nature would continue to produce mysteries of its own. Secrets would remain, motives would simmer, and ordinary life would conceal extraordinary complexities. Yet, with careful attention, observation, and patience, the hidden could always be discerned. As she gazed out at the snow-covered rooftops of Little Hemsby, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice, as subtle as it might sometimes be, had been served. The village had been restored to a cautious peace, and the threads of deception had been untangled. She returned to her knitting, needles moving in a steady rhythm, content in the knowledge that, even in a world of ordinary facades and hidden motives, careful observation and understanding of human nature would always illuminate the truth. And so, Little Hemsby resumed its gentle, measured life. The shadows of recent events lingered, faint, yet undeniable, and the villagers carried with them both lessons and memories. Miss Marple, ever serene and perceptive, remained quietly vigilant, knowing that life, with its hidden intricacies and subtle revelations, would always present another puzzle to solve. The winter snow had melted from Little Hemsby's streets, leaving behind the soft traces of footprints and the faint memory of frost on rooftops. Life had resumed its ordinary rhythm, though the village now carried with it a quiet awareness, an understanding that beneath the serene surface of daily routine, human hearts often harbored secrets, and the smallest actions could reveal the deepest truths. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by her window, reflected on the events that had unfolded. Leonard Strathmore's tragic death, the theft at the post office, and the hidden manipulations of Mrs. Carroway and Mr. Bentley had each revealed the complexity of human nature. She considered how fear, resentment, ambition, and guilt had intertwined to produce acts both shocking and calculated. And yet, she knew that even the most ordinary of people could, at times, be capable of extraordinary duplicity or of subtle heroism. Her satisfaction lay not in the exposure of the guilty alone, but in the careful unraveling of human behavior, the patient attention to gestures, hesitation, and unspoken thoughts. It was this quiet observation, the understanding of patterns in human conduct, that had led to the truth, and it was this same skill that would continue to guide her in the mysteries yet to come. The villagers, unaware of how precisely Miss Marple had discerned the full story, resumed their lives. They laughed again, repaired fences, tended gardens, and spoke cautiously yet kindly with one another. And though the shadow of recent events lingered, it served as a reminder. Appearances might deceive, but human nature, in all its subtlety, was never truly hidden from a careful observer. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the needles clicking softly as the sun set behind the quiet hills. In the stillness of the evening, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. knowing that while one mystery had been solved, the world would always present another, waiting for those willing to see beyond what is immediately visible. And so, in the gentle calm of little Hempsby, life continued, ordinary, and yet enriched by the understanding that even in a small village, the human heart contains depths worth watching, waiting, and, when necessary, unveiling. The stranger beneath the mistletoe had departed, the guilty had been revealed, and the village, though forever changed, had found a cautious peace. And Miss Marple, ever serene and perceptive, remained quietly vigilant, ready for the next subtle puzzle, hidden behind the ordinary, waiting to reveal its secrets to one who observed with patience, wisdom, and quiet insight.